interest of time, we should probably get started. So welcome everyone to the occasional seminar of the linguistics discipline. And today's talk is by Sunny Boy Mahboob, who's going to talk about future linguistics. And as you're connected to Zoom there, you'll be able to address the live and Zoom crowd. So over to you.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody. I know it's a short notice. We just announced this on Wednesday. So thank you for showing up here. And thank you for all the people who are online at the moment. And hi. So I'm just going to go right into it because we have limited time and there's a lot that I want to cover. We can't talk about the future of linguistics in an hour. So hopefully I'll plant some seeds and put some questions out there for us to sort of think around, and maybe later on at some point, perhaps even have a symposium to discuss these issues much more deeply. So I'll start off with a poem. This is called Simply Splendid, Simply Splendid. So this is based, if you know the flag, the black flag in the background is the British East India Company. So the poem starts off in the 1850s and then goes into 1940s. These are significant eras in South Asia, if you're aware of the South Asian history. So 1850s. Sir, the danger is increasing. The natives are resisting. How ignorant, how savage. They don't appreciate our attempts to salvage. How can they know what's best for them? Let's save them in our God's name. Burn their books, destroy their past. Let us teach them what we want. Introduce money, buy us friends, give some wealth and lots of lands. Teach people religion, to hate each other, break their union into different nations. Create new symbols, build new systems, change the ways they think and function. When this is done, come back to me and I will tell you what next can be. So we will move into the 1940s. Sir, I'm pleased to report our progress. Your directives have brought us success. The natives are divided and broken. They're killing each other in dozens. Splendid, simply splendid. And now for the next bits. Let us retire to our beautiful estate. Let our friends govern their new states. With our stories to guide their future, we can relax and let them suffer. Sell them books and let them know if they want progress, they can come for more. Invite some natives, give them means, turn them into posters for the rest to dream. When this is done, it will be seen. Those who fought us now fight in between. Splendid, simply splendid. Now, I wanted to start off with this point because it sort of sets out how colonization actually created the divide and conquer elements. How did it actually conquer the rest of the world? How did a group of European powers from a small continent in a small part of the world go around and capture everything else? And part of that was done through dividing people. And divisions were made through a lot of different strategies. Very often they are based within the academia, but including, for example, religion, race, but for our purposes, language and linguistics. So in a sense, the modern linguistics that we study and do is based in the era of the colonial past, where the purpose of the colonial past was to actually create the divisions. So I'll talk very briefly about a few problems, and then actually want to spend more time about ways of remedying the problems that we have. Now, one of the key problems is that not just that the origins of linguistics are in the colonial era, but the modern linguists haven't really changed that. We still continue to use the same methodologies and approaches, and doing that, we essentially, unfortunately, continue to create divisions. In fact, that is where my problem is. We need to rethink linguistics so that we stop making divisions in people. Now, let me just give you a few examples here. So this is an example, a question that I asked when I was at the University of Balochistan. Actually, I've been asking this question for a long time. Why is it that Balochi and Brahui are considered two languages when the speakers are mutually intelligible and the two share a large proportion of their vocabulary? Now, why is it that there is so much overlap, they're mutually intelligible, and yet they're not just called two different languages, but in the case of Brahui, it's considered a Dravidian language. Dravidian language in Pakistan. How did that happen? Now, unfortunately or fortunately, it goes back to this guy, Dennis Bray. Notice he is an ICS officer. That means he's an Indian Civil Services. He was essentially based in the Brumby region. And while he was in the Brumby region, he had one of the people who became a traitor to his own tribe and became an informant to Bray. And using a single informant with very limited data, no training in real linguistics, he claimed that Brumby is a Dravidian language. And he separated out Brumby from Balochi. This continues today, until today. So if you look at Google Brumby, it comes up, Brumby is a Dravidian language. Now, on what ground did he actually claim that? Really, not much. He was a civil service. His purpose really was to create British rule in that region. Look at another example. If we look at the Philippines, the indigenous writing systems in the Philippines, they were all syllabic, all of them. I mean, there were quite a few of them, and they were all syllabic. Now, they were systematically destroyed by the Spaniards, and then they were replaced and continue to be replaced by linguists who create phonemic scripts. Now, phonetic scripts are arguably the worst kind of writing system, because every time you have a change in speech or dialect, the spelling correspondence gets messed up. That's why, for example, the Afro-Americans have a problem with the spellings. The Chicano-Americans have a problem with the spellings, because the spellings using phonetic scripts are the most problematic. And yet, linguists create those scripts all over the world. Looking at another example, in 2017, a new language was discovered by a PhD student called Jadet in Malaysia. Now, the local Malays questioned it, and they were saying that this is not a real new language. It's a dialect, it's a register. But no attention was given to the fact, and these papers keep getting published. So we create a body of knowledge which is actually not based on any understanding of the local. It's a student going in, collecting data, creating a dissertation, saying, oh, we've got a new language. And they get highlighted, they get promotions, they get everything. Another example, in South Asia, not even South Asia, just India, where there were hardly any named languages, even Hindi and Urdu. These names are from the 1850s, 1860s. For example, Ghalib, the most well-known poet of that era, never said he was a poet of Urdu, because the term Urdu was coined later, right? There was no Urdu and Hindi. And now there are over 19,500 languages. And with each language, there's a division. And when you have a few resources, when you have poverty, when you have people who don't have stuff, then each division creates the potential of conflict. And that, if you look around South Asia, you see the conflicts everywhere. So these are some of the problems that are foundational. Now, what modern linguistics does, and I'm moving on from the foundations, if you look around what we do today, if we take up any of the elementary basic introduction to linguistics, for example, Yule's book that is very commonly used, or which is also very commonly used. Now, both of them, notice, either in chapter 1 or chapter 2, they create a distinction between animal communication and human language. So humans have language, animals have communication. Now, notice they actually do not define language. They do not define language. There is no definition of language in these books. Yet, there's a creation of a notion or an idea of a language based on a contrast between humans and non-humans. Now, on what basis do they do that? Of course, we all learn it because we go to school, we go to college, we learn from these books. We have to pass our exams, so we memorize all of this and we follow it. But on what grounds is it? What is the evidence for creating that distinction? Nil. In fact, if I go to my own Boli, I don't like to name it, my own Boli, then in my Boli, everything has language. Boli itself means a speech. A cow has Boli, a tree has Boli, a cockroach has Boli, a fly has Boli, everything has Boli, a river has Boli. So notice we animate, give the feature of Boli, which means we see everything as animated, as being alive. Whereas in English and in linguistics, there's this demarcation between human language and non-human communication. And based on that differentiation, there's a whole discipline that comes into play. That's a problem, right? So I'll go very quickly to three more problems. One, that modern linguistics primarily recognizes and encourages either structural or functional analysis. That's pretty much it. That modern linguistics often conflates writing, which is a visual system, and speech, which is an auditory system, into the concept of language. And for the most part, it ignores sign language and braille. And then modern language does not recognize that all sensory systems, not just sound or sight, but all sensory systems are meaning-making and may be used for communication. So now I'm going to address these problems by looking at how to go around and fixing them. But before them, just a few key observations. Key observation number one, that linguists have developed theories of language which are anthropocentric, that is human-centric, that is based on a division of human languages and non-human communication. And within human language, they prioritize speech and writing, often confusing these two as modes of language. And I will argue these are not modes of language. These are different sensory systems. Modes can only exist within a sensory system, not across sensory systems. Now, in applied linguistics is even worse, because a lot of applied linguists don't even think about what language is. So in a lot of conversations that I've had with Stephen Krashen, the guy who's done SLA guy, he says that he's never really thought about what language is. Now, my question is, if you have not thought about what language is, how can you be doing applied linguistics? How can you be doing TESOL? How can you be doing language education if you don't know what language is? Now, of course, the problem isn't just theirs, because linguists don't define language often. As just said, they contrast it with human language, non-human communication. So given these issues, how can we trust any of this work? That is where I am. I sort of said, abandon all of it. How can I trust anything? Because I don't see any evidence anywhere. So with that, I say, let's create something new, something that is actually observable, something that we can all share, we can see evidence of, and we can build from there based on our common experiences as a human being. So the first thing to do is define language. Now, the first definition of language that I'll share 4 interrelated language definitions. They're interrelated. The first one you guys would know already, especially if you have done systemic functional linguistics, that language, or I preferably call it speech or BOLI, is a semogenic system. It's a meaning-making system, which operates through sound. Sign language and reading operate through sight, and braille operates through touch. We'll talk a bit more about this in a bit. 2, language is a socio-semiotic inheritance. Now, what do I mean by this? Where do we learn our language? How do we get our language? We get our language from our elders, from our communities. How did our elders get their language? From their elders. How did they get their language? From their elders. It's something that's passed on. It's comparable to the DNA. DNA is biological. Language is sociological. But it is our inheritance, it's a sociological inheritance. Now, imagine this. If we were going to inherit a house and somebody comes over and takes over our house, we would take them to court. We will not let them have it. We will claim it that that's ours. But in case of language, notice what we do. Not just that we don't worry about it, we often give up our own language. We give up our own inheritance in order to learn something which is seen more powerful, more dominant. Right? In my context of my country, it might be what we call Urdu. But in contexts of other places, it might be another one. It might be English. But we give up our own social inheritance in order to gain another language. And doing that, we lose something very important. We lose our inheritance. Why? Because of the third definition. Language is science. Now, this bothers a lot of people. How can language be science? Now, if you strip science out of methodologies and applications, like take away the application, take away the methodology, what you have as the foundation of a science are classificatory systems, are taxonomies, ways of classifying and categorizing the world. That is the fundamental science. So for example, think about chemistry, you have the periodic table, right? All of it is based on classifying and categorizing. That's the foundation of all sciences. Now, where does that categorization and classification comes? It comes in the language. Now, imagine, take us back a few hundred years, 300, 400 years ago. Most human beings were nomadic. They had a range in which they would live, right? Most people would not be flying over and everywhere. They would be based in a pretty specific geographical range. They'll move around in that range, but that's where they be. Now, if they've been there for hundreds of thousands of years, then over that time, they have understood the nature of the land, of the animals, of the plants, of everything. They know everything on their land. And everything is related or referred to in there or encoded within the language. So the language carries the knowledge of the land. Right? Now, when we take away our inheritance, when we take away our language, essentially we are losing that inheritance, we're losing that science. This is part of what happens with all indigenous people today. When they've lost their language, they don't really know what's there anymore. Right? So for example, in my part of the world, we have been so into English or Urdu that we don't know what grows in our own backyard. We don't have that knowledge anymore. That knowledge is gone. Because now we all eat strawberries, because S is for strawberry. Now, growing strawberries in my part of the world, we don't neither have the climate nor the soil for it, but we're still doing it, right? The impacts of these things are huge. There are huge sets of environmental impacts that we need to consider, in addition to sociological impacts. Now, the fourth definition that I'd like to talk about is that language is a complex dynamic system. Now, what that means is that language is evolving, is emergent. It's emergent. So what I am speaking now, it's emerging at the moment, right? If I were to give this talk again, it will not be the same because language emerges in context, in place, in a space, in time. And it always varies. Now, what that of course means is that if language is always varying, it's always changing, how can we write static grammars? How can we write a grammar that's static? That says a grammar of this language is like this. Wait a second, how can it be? Because language is emergent. People will change it all the time. And this is a problem with any notion of a standard grammar. Like, how can you learn a standard grammar? If you learn a standard grammar of English, you will sound like a textbook. You will not sound like a human being because language is changing all the time. So when we see all of these four definitions together, we start sort of understanding and grasping language. Now, before I move on, this is, I published this a couple of years ago. Now, this, of course, is an academic sort of a talk, and it's academically done. But I like to think about things in different genres. There's no reason why we need to restrict ourselves within academic constraints of academic writing. So I will share with you another point. This one is called language. It also defines language, but in a very different way, using poetry as a way of thinking about language. Language. Like computer languages program machines, human language programs people. And while we do have other senses, language can shape how we use those too. Language co-evolved with where she grew, with lands, creatures, and seasons she knew. Our elders learned all that was needed and taught it to us through boli and practice. The flow of sounds, the melodies of song, the rhythm of knowledge, the grammars of dance, the meaning of colors, the semantics of smell, the sense of touch, the discourse of flavor, a harmonic system in a mystical garden. All that changed when our tongue was cut, our laws replaced by foreign words, our knowledge drowned in information floods, our wisdom stolen through tests and books, our tradition slaughtered by trends and fads, our integrity murdered with greed and wants, our humanity turned into an infectious wound, an agitated system in a turbulent existence. This is where we are at the moment. We can see the impacts of it around us. There's no need for me to highlight it. Just look at any part of the world. We see conflict, we see poverty, we see violence, we see environmental destruction. So there is something going wrong. And if our knowledge creation was doing the thing it should have been doing, then the world would be a nicer and a better place. So I put the responsibility on my own shoulders and the responsibility on the shoulders of academics, the knowledge creators. Because if we were creating knowledge that was a harmonizing knowledge, then the world would be harmonizing. Because it's our knowledge that we create that sippers down into school textbooks, goes down into schooling everywhere. But if our knowledge production is one which is divisive, then there's a problem. So we really need to rethink where we are and what we are doing and what we need to be doing. Alternative two, because linguistics, even if we talk about all of those things in language, language itself is limited because language is just one way in which we create knowledge and communicate. We need to relate it to all kinds of meaning making, all sensory systems. Now, before I do that, I'll just pose a question, quick question. Now, in the physical world, most people will agree that everything that is material or biological, it comprises of atoms. Atom is like the smallest building block of the physical world. Now, of course, there are subatomic particles, there's all that stuff too. But most people who work in the material biological sciences agree there's atom is the smallest bit. Now, let me ask you the question. What's the parallel of an atom in a socio-semiotic world? So if the material biological world is comprised of atoms, what is the socio-semiotic world, the world that lives in our minds? What is the little thing that is the foundation for that? And we will note right away that we are never taught that. We are never told what it is. And I'll tell you what it is in a second. It's pretty simple. And when I tell it to you, it will make sense. In fact, I'll tell you now. It's symbols. Everything that is socio-semiotic operates on symbols, whether it is religion, whether it's culture, whether it is language, anything. All socio-semiotic systems operate on symbols. So in a sense, there is no reason why we have all these various disciplines. Yes, we can have different foci. Even economics operates on symbols. Money is a symbol. Everything operates on symbols. But instead of thinking of it comprehensively and seeing symbols as a building block and then using symbols to understand all the various aspects of human existence, we divide ourselves up into different disciplines and then sub-disciplines, and then we do very specific studies within that. In a sense, we need to get out of that because we need to start thinking that it's symbolic relationships everywhere. So if once we start doing that, we will start to move beyond the kind of traps we are in. Now, of course, the world that we live in, the material biological world, we might think we know what it is, but we really don't. The only way we experience it is through our sensory systems. And then we use our sensory systems to interpret things and share things. So one of the places I like to start off is making a contrast between the material biological world and a socio-semiotic world. Now, I don't differentiate between material biological. I see them as the same because just like linguists do not define language, but create a discipline of linguistics, biology does exactly the same. Biology does not define life. You can Google that. Biology does not define life, but instead what it does, it looks at characteristics of life. And then it uses the characteristics of life to contrast living things and non-living things. And then uses living things as the focus of biology. And then within that, it creates taxonomies. It creates a distinction between plants and animals. Now, on what grounds do they do that? In indigenous knowledge, everything is alive. It's Mother Earth that is alive. We don't differentiate. We don't see trees as being less than animals. They are the same. Now, once a biologist creates a taxonomy and puts trees down and animals up, then we see trees as having no cognition, no feelings, no sentiments, and then we are able to go and chop it. But in indigenous knowledge, when we see trees as equal to us, we are not permitted to go and chop live trees. It's not allowed. Yeah, you can use a dead tree when it's already fallen, but you can't cut a tree because a tree is alive just like us. Notice biology does exactly what linguistics does. This is actually a problem across all of the colonial sciences, and we really need to think around it. Today's talk focuses on language, so we'll stick to that. Now, the material biological world is made of matter, that it has physical existence. Now, notice I put socio-semiotics together too, because anything that is alive interacts with the rest of the world around it. So we don't know how it sees the world. We cannot see the world from a tree's perspective, but a tree interacts with its environment. So it has its own semiotics. An ant, we don't know what an ant does. We can't understand an ant or a fly or a mosquito, but they interact in the environment. And so they must be able to make sense of that environment. Therefore, they also have socio-semiotics. Now, because we are humans today, we'll restrict it to ways of thinking humans, but we have to consider all things, everything. Now, material biological worlds, as we said, it comprises of atoms. Socio-semiotic world is comprised of non-particles. We call them symbols. Everything is symbolic. The material particles interact with each other based on physical properties. Non-material particles are placed into patterns. So symbols are patterns. They're patterns. We create patterns. That's what grammar does. We create patterns. Now, maths can be used to study the biological material world. We can count things. We can count 1 font, 2 fonts, 3 fonts. Now, mathematics does not operate in the socio-semiotic world. Why? Because mathematics itself is a socio-semiotic invention. Numbers don't exist in nature. Humans create numbers. The history of zero is only 5,000 years old. There was no zero 5,000 years before that, right? So numbers themselves are a socio-semiotic construct. They don't operate in it. And yet notice, so many of social scientists do surveys and use numbers to understand social worlds. It doesn't work. That's why we partly create the world we do. We mess things up. Existence may or may not be dependent on humans, right? So a tree exists without human intervention. But of course, a faun is the creation of the humans. But for socio-semiotics to exist, it has to have humans. Our socio-semiotics would not exist if we didn't exist. Our beliefs, our thoughts, our ideas exist because we exist. If we don't exist, none of that exists. Now, the material biological world may exist without socio-semiotics, right? So a faun doesn't have socio-semiotics. But we cannot. So we cannot exist without material biological. Socio-semiotics must have material biology. Now, to change the material biological world, I've been picking up my phone and putting it down again. We need to use force. But to make changes in the socio-semiotic world, we may or may not need force, right? That's what education is all about. We can educate people and change their ideas without force. And of course, you can use force to influence people as well, which is what colonization did, the classic approach to it. Now, changes in the material biological world are influenced by the principles of the material biological world, whatever that might be. The cool thing about socio-semiotics is that changes can occur at any time and for any reason. This is grounds for hope, that things can change because we do not need force. What we need is a change of thinking. And by change of thinking, the approaches that we do is changes. And therefore, the way that we relate to the material biological world changes. And through that, we can reharmonize. Now, typically, material biological world is studied in disciplines in sciences, for example, physics, chemistry, biology. And typically, we study the socio-semiotic world like sociology, linguistics, economics, religious studies. We divide them up. And I said, we don't need to. Notice they all operate symbolically. They all operate on symbols. They just use symbols in a different context. If we can create understanding of symbols at a more comprehensive level, then we can actually work to reharmonize things instead of dividing ourselves up into linguists, applied linguists, language educationists, sociologists, this kind of sociologists, that kind of sociologists, and economists. Why? Notice that's the structure of an institution that does that. It isn't the knowledge itself. So we need to rethink all of it. Now, of course, this material, biological, and the socio-semiotic world exists by themselves, but for us to engage with it, we as an individual or as humans, we can only engage with the world in the maximum of 5 sensory systems, 5 maximum. Not everybody has the 5, and not everybody uses the 5 in the same way, but that's all that we have, right? So we have our material, biological sensory systems, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And notice I've grouped them. We have all learned these things from our primary school. Now, what we have never been taught really is that there's a hierarchy within them and there's a grouping within them. Now, I'll explain this to you quickly because we do have to look at other things, but this is actually, maybe we'll come back to it during question time. Now, the key distinction from group A and group B is that for sight and sound, things can be present. So for those of you who are in the room, you can see me, I can see you. We are in the present. But people who are online or people who might watch a recording, they are in the non-present. right? They're not present. Now, textbooks, anything that we read is in the non-present because it takes us away into another world. It changes our dimensionality. But for group B, I cannot taste this coffee unless I was picked it up and I drank it. I have the taste of coffee in my mouth right now. 2 hours later, I will not have it. I can have a memory of it. I can recall how the coffee tasted, but the taste is no longer there. The temperature, the feeling of the temperature is no longer there. It's gone. The smell of the coffee is no longer there. It has to be in the present. Now, the sequencing is extremely important. Now we can look at the sequencing. I can give you lots of different examples. I'll just restrict myself to two. One, for example, in terms of human relationships, and two, in terms of our survival. Okay. Now, in terms of human relationships, just because I see some people out there, I can see lots of people out there walking around, I can see they're human beings, but I don't know them. There's no relationship. I just recognize them as humans. Like Felix, I just met him yesterday on the street. So I didn't know he was a human being. I saw him as a human being walking around. It was only after we started talking through sound that we started to build a relationship. Just because I saw him didn't mean that I knew him. But once we started talking, then it started creating a relationship. Now, I didn't feel that he was really foul smelling, so I kept talking to him. But if he smelled bad to me, I would walk away. Or, I wouldn't hang out with him, right? Because of the nature of human interactions. If you smell all right, we might build a better relationship. Now, touch and taste are quite culturally defined. I haven't touched him except for the shake hand. When he left yesterday, we shook hands. Now, who you shake hands with is culturally determined. In different parts of the world, it's different. And taste is very restricted to intimate relationships, right? We don't share taste. It's an intimate relationship that you share taste. So you can see with this hierarchy, we can look at how human relationships operate. We can also see it in terms of human survival. Now, I can see, for example, in the distance, there's fire, there's a glow, there's fire happening. I can see it, it's very far. I can see there's a fire, but I'm not too worried. Now, if I start hearing the sound of fire, then I need to be worried. Why? Because it's getting close, or the direction of the fire is towards me. I need to start taking action or taking precautions. Now, if I can start smelling fire, it means the wind is coming this way, the sound is there, I can see it getting closer, I need to take action now. If I can feel the heat, I need to take action now. And if I've tasted fire, I'm dead. So we can see how there is a sequencing of these sensory systems. Now, notice in indigenous education, actually, let's just think about before indigenous education, let's think about how a human child learns. A human child starts learning in the womb of the mother. They can start to hear things and sounds within it. They taste things. So when a child is born, the strongest relationship between a child is between the child and the mother. Why? Because of these relationships, the touch, taste, and smell. The sound develops later. The language comes later. And the language actually directs how people will see things. So whether I see this chair as maroon or red depends on how I carve the space. And that's done through language. So my sight is influenced by language. So notice in terms of human development, we first learn through taste, touch, and smell. And then we look at sight, sound, and sight. That's why there's been tons of experiments when you take little infants and babies and you put them in a dark room with 5 different women, the child will always recognize the mother. They will never be confused because they don't need sight and sound. They learn and they understand through touch, taste, and smell. This is why children will pick up everything and put it in their mouths. You've seen that, right? They put everything in the mouth. It's the elders who have to monitor the children because they might hurt themselves. Why do they do that? Because they learn from taste, touch, and smell first. Now, notice in the education that we do today, and especially with the online education, it's restricted to sight and sound. We have taken away touch, taste, touch, and smell. Just taken it away. We're doing schooling online for children, 5-year, 6-year-old kids doing online education. That takes it away. Now, what it does too is puts everything in the non-presence. Things that are not present are non-observable. We cannot observe them. We don't experience them. What that implies is that if we are going to accept something that is in the non-presence, we have to believe the person. We have to believe what's in the book. There is no observance. Those of you who are in the room, you can come and have a check that there is coffee inside indeed, so I was telling you the truth. But those of them, people online, they can't ever tell that. They will never be able to tell whether it's coffee or tea or water or something else. How do they know? They have to trust me, right? If I write a book, how do they know what I'm telling them in the book is actually correct? They have to trust me. And notice we are made to trust through education from our childhood. We are made to learn from books, not through observance. And we are taught things that are not accurate. We started off by looking at the linguistic textbooks, differentiate between human language and non-human communication. There is no evidence for it, and yet we all learn it, and we start believing in it. We build our socio-semiotic beliefs on things that are factually incorrect, but they're brought to us in books, and we have to accept it, because if we don't, we do not graduate. We don't pass our exams. If I didn't learn all of that stuff, I wouldn't be here. I have to memorize it. I have to learn it. I have to replicate it. I have to provide evidence to my professors that I have accepted this stuff. Now, what if that stuff is actually wrong? I'm doomed. I'm just messed up, because even if I'm in the observance, I can make a mistake. Even if somebody is being totally honest with me, I can make a mistake in my understanding. But if somebody is deliberately telling me lies, then I'm doomed, because I've accepted and believed it when it's not true. And I can give you hundreds of examples of it, right? Just think about gender. In my part of the world, we always had 3 genders, male, female, and the middle part. They were taken away in the 1860s when the British government said, no, there are only 2 genders, males and females. They essentially took away a third of our population and turned them into hijras. And they were either forced to, assimilate with the males or assimilate with the females, or they became street beggars, hijras. How come? Because the classificatory system of English looks at 2 genders. It doesn't recognize 3 genders. It's a grammatical thing, which is then imposed on sociology, into social policy. And when you apply these things on social policy, you deharmonize the communities. Right? So these things are extremely important. So human learning happens through these things, but notice modern education operates through sight and sound, and especially with Zoom and internet-based things. Now, in doing all of this, we have to create new alternatives. We have to create new approaches, methods, and methodologies, because we can't stick with the old. There's too many problems. Now, how do I do it? One of the ways I do it is broadly conceptualizing subaltern linguistics. This is a broad conceptualization, essentially saying that anybody can do sublinguistics because we all use language. The key thing is that we do it for our own empowerment and our community's empowerment, well-being, and prosperity. We create things that harmonize things. So the goal of subaltern linguistics is to create economies, practices, projects, and resources that can be made and used by community members and leaders to develop and promote community beneficial socio-semiotic processes in their own language or a language of their choice. Now, this is a very broad idea. To operationalize it, I turned it into what I call the credible research. Now, notice credible is in alignment with reliability, validity, credibility. We all know what reliability and validity are, but nobody talks about credibility. That's my first point. Is our work credible? If it is credible, then I will talk about validity and reliability. If not, I don't worry about that stuff. First thing is credibility. What is credibility? It is contextually relevant. It responds to practical needs. It engages its stakeholders. We're not collecting data. We are engaging with human beings. They are our stakeholders. They are our fellow citizens. They have to work together. We draw on understanding of the local knowledge and practice, and at the same time, we're informed by diverse approaches and experiences. And when I say that, I'm not just saying Western, I'm saying any of it, anywhere. The key thing, of course, is that it has to benefit somebody. What's the point of spending 4 or 5 years doing a PhD when at the end of the day, nobody gets any benefit out of it? Wouldn't we be better off spending those 5 years doing something where we create benefit for our communities and ourselves? We have to think about benefit. We have to do a cost-benefit analysis. If there is no benefit, let's not do it. It's not credible. Right? And once you do all of this, guess what? If you're creating resources for your own community, doing creative stuff, doing things that change your community and your life, you're leading yourself and the field because nobody else is doing it. Of course, all of this has to be done through ethically. And when I say ethically, I'm not talking about consent forms. I'm talking about ethics. We can spend another 3 weeks talking about what ethics are, right? But it has to be ethical, not talking about legal frameworks. So the credible is a framework that allows me to operationalize subaltern linguistics in a certain way. But that itself is not practical because this is still a framework. Now, to make this even more something that you can do in a classroom, in a community, I talk about positive discourse analysis, using positive discourse analysis as a way of actually enabling all of this. So what is positive discourse analysis? It privileges things and discourses that promote empowerment and social change, which means things that work. We look at things that work, not critical discourse analysis. We're not looking at problems and why the problems exist. We're looking at positive discourse analysis, meaning we're looking at good examples, models that are efficient, models that have changed the world. We're studying those. And we're not just looking at language, we're looking at things, actual things and practices. So PDA can be narrow, which is if you're doing it from a linguistic perspective, we're doing linguistic analysis, then it can be a narrow PDA. But what I like to do is a broad PDA, which means we're working with all sensory systems. So the work I do is with all sensory systems. And again, if we had time, I will go into a lot more detail into this. Now, PDA can be carried out both to examine and design things. This is the key thing. We learn how good things work. And then after learning how good things work, we apply the same framework in order to create new things, which will also work because we are learning for success. Now, today we have limited time, so I haven't been able to go into all the details I want to, but I want to point out this book that I've released, not published. It goes into quite a bit more detail into all of these things, what positive discourse analysis is. So the introduction talks about all the various sensory systems and things. The credible approach exemplifies what credible is. Positive discourse analysis, chapter 3, looks at how to use PDA to analyze things. And chapter 4, notice it's called Say No to Sugar. It tells us how to use PDA to design things. Why say no to sugar? Because sugar is a big problem around the world. Especially if you work in indigenous communities, you know how problematic sugar is. Then section 2 looks at examples of students who have used this approach to create their own projects. And then section 3 talks about moving forward with education, taking us forward. Now, I'll quickly go through examples very quickly because I'm conscious of time as well. Now, one example of it is FLC Language Travels, which actually created a microeconomy using language in a remote minority community. So in Malacca with the Kristang community, we actually worked with the Kristang community in order to generate funds for them, but even more to create resources. And this is something that's ongoing. We created it as a practice, as a project, and now we left it with the community, and they have been continuing doing it again and again. Because they are generating funds, and I'll show you, I'll give you examples. I'll show you the examples. I'll give you examples. So we've got this stuff. Then I will skip all of this. Notice there are kids here. So our teachers were the kids, right? So the children were our teachers. And these were all, of course, guided by the elders. Now, these children, before they joined the project, they were actually not doing too well in school because they came from a minority background. They didn't speak the dominant dialect or language. And so they were struggling. Some of them were failing. In the time that they spent with us, their whole personalities changed and evolved. All of these students became A students after this project, because during that project, they became empowered. They realized the value of their language. They realized that they weren't weak or they didn't know stuff, but they were actually the bosses. Now, if we had time, I would show you some of the videos from this session to look at it, but I'll skip it today. Now, all of this was documented into a dissertation, master's dissertation, which looks at creating a language-based microeconomy through tourism and prestige planning. So looking at how you actually do prestige planning. So how do you build prestige within the language? And then I continue to work with the community and the elders, and the elders work with the children to create resources. So we created a children's book. Both of these are published by University of Malaya Press. So they were both published from University of Malaya. The text is written all by the indigenous community, the elders. All the illustrations are by the children. And these books are now available to the students. There's a YouTube version. There's all of this stuff. So the community is using it. This is more for adults. It includes descriptions of language. It includes the sort of stuff that linguists look at. But the children's book is just a children's book. And notice it's trilingual. So it's Kristan, Bahasa Malay, and English. So trilingual. So the resource is there. Now it's available in the community. We gave it free of charge. So everybody in the household, all the families have the copies of this book. They use it to teach their children. So we can see that's ongoing benefit of it, not just money, right? Now, alternative 4, design and create new genres. So I'll look at very quickly at a book that came out of a master's project. It's called The Ribbit Ribbit Pond. Now, the Ribbit Ribbit Pond has been translated already into 26 languages, and there are audio-visual versions on YouTube, and there are workbooks based on the Ribbit Ribbit Pond to teach Chinese, English, and Vietnamese, and it's still growing. Now, we don't have time today, so I won't go through this, but I will show it to you. You can actually look at it yourself, and I'll send a link to people online. So if you go here to FLC website, then you can see books in publication, the Ribbit Ribbit Pond. Oh, sorry. And then you can see, come on. Oh, what did I do? Okay, so you can, come on. So you can go here and you can select any of the languages. So you can choose any two. It doesn't have to be English-based. You can put Punjabi and you can put Thai. It doesn't have to be English-based. So you can see how it can then be used to teach any language. So this is just an example.
All the languages are dominant group of languages.
No. There are indigenous languages there too. And we're getting more, right? Definitely. We've got Sindhi, we've got Punjabi, we've got Yoruba, we've got tons of languages. And we're hoping to get more. So it's still working on it. And then it's going forward. This was turned into, of course, this was part of a master's thesis. And notice the master's dissertation is not written like a typical dissertation. It doesn't go introduction, literature review, methodology. No, it's unit 1 and then lesson 1, lesson 2. It's written pedagogically. It's written by using all the references. All of it is there. You know, the interpersonal meanings, the verbal mode, the visual mode, all that stuff, all the reading is there, but it's presented as a textbook. So anybody who reads this book, it's even got activities. So if you read this book, you will learn how to write and make your own books. So we altered the dissertation itself, the genre of the dissertation. Right? And then in one of the only big projects that I'm working on, setting up a new encyclopedia of English in the real world with Routledge, we're essentially recreating the genres that we need to, because we have realized that the current genres don't allow us to do the kind of work we need to do. And we know that as academics, as students, we need to be publishing. So how do we get to do new stuff if the domains or the powerhouses of knowledge are keeping the lid on what it already is? They're not letting us to change things. So through this encyclopedia, we are working together. We've got people from all over the world who are editors and sub-editors, and we're working together to reconceptualize the kind of genres we need to create in order to do the kind of work we need to do within the academic domains. So this is a project that will take another 5 years to be released, right? And I'll finish off just like I started with a poem. Come, Nomad, you have seen enough. unharnessed greed runs over the world like a polluted river, spreading as she flows. Come, Nomad, you have heard enough. Unashamed voices sing songs of lies, full of rhymes that silence sounds of pain. Come, Nomad, you have learned enough. Now walk towards the place of possibility, where we can contribute to create harmony. Thank you.
All right, well, we have a little bit of time for anyone who wants